A judge attempts to target Karoline Leavitt with an unfair fine. What happened next left the entire courtroom in shock. The mahogany doors of courtroom 7 gleamed under the fluorescent lights, their polished surface reflecting the nervous faces of those waiting in the hallway. Among them stood Karoline Leavitt, her slender fingers clutching a worn leather briefcase. She wore a pink pantsuit, the fabric smooth against her skin, providing a thin veil of professional armor against what awaited her inside. The courtroom itself was a cathedral of intimidation. High ceilings adorned with ornate crown molding loomed above rows of spectator benches, their dark wood surfaces worn smooth by decades of anxious observers. Judge Walter Hammond presided from his elevated position, a man in his 60s with steel gray hair and eyes like flint. He wore his black robe as if it were made of chainmail rather than fabric, the garment flowing around his broad shoulders as he shifted in his high-backed leather chair. The sound of his gavel striking the wooden block echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Case number 47,293, Leavitt versus Springfield County Tax Authority, announced the bailiff, a stocky man whose uniform strained against his chest. His voice carried the practiced monotone of someone who had announced thousands of cases, each as unremarkable to him as the last. Karoline felt her heart thrum against her rib cage as she moved forward, the carpet beneath her feet absorbing the click of her sensible heels. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everyone in a slightly sickly pallor. She placed her briefcase on the defense table, the sound of the metal clasps opening like tiny cymbals in the hushed room. "Ms. Leavitt," Judge Hammond drawled, looking down at her over half-moon glasses that perched precariously on his aquiline nose. "Representing yourself today? Bold choice." His tone carried the unmistakable chill of condescension, each syllable carefully crafted to make her feel small. "Yes, Your Honor," Karoline replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. She stood straight, shoulders back, her chin tilted slightly upward, a posture that reflected determination rather than defiance. A murmur rippled through the spectators section, where a handful of locals sat watching the proceedings with the casual interest of those who had nowhere better to be on a Tuesday morning. The prosecutor, Alan Whitfield, sat at his table, idly straightening his red tie against his crisp white shirt. His expression was one of bored confidence, the look of a man who had never tasted defeat in this particular arena. "Well, let's not waste the court's time," Hammond continued, shuffling papers before him with deliberate slowness. "The county claims you failed to properly report business income for 3 consecutive years." "I have documentation proving otherwise, Your Honor," Karoline responded, her voice carrying just enough projection to fill the room. From her briefcase, she extracted a neatly organized folder of documents, the papers inside color-coded with translucent tabs. Judge Hammond's expression soured, his mouth pulling into a tight line that disappeared into the folds of his jowls. "Ms. Leavitt, I've reviewed your submitted materials and found them inadequate." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Karoline felt a prickle of heat at the nape of her neck, creeping upward along her scalp. The judge was dismissing her before she'd even begun. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the documentation meets all statutory requirements," she countered, sliding a specific page forward. The paper made a soft whisper as it moved across the polished wood. The judge's eyes narrowed to slits, like a predator assessing its prey. "Ms. Leavitt, I'm finding you in contempt of court for your tone. That will be a fine of $500. The room seemed to still, the air growing dense and difficult to breathe. Karoline felt a flash of indignation, hot and bright behind her sternum. The fine was clearly punitive, designed to put her in her place. But beneath her righteous anger, something else stirred: curiosity. This reaction seemed disproportionate, almost personal. "Your Honor," she began carefully, her mind racing ahead like a chess player seeing 5 moves forward. "May I request clarification on which aspect of my tone constituted contempt?" The judge's face flushed crimson, the color spreading upward from his collar like spilled wine. "Are you questioning my authority in my own courtroom?" he thundered, his voice resonating off the walls. "Not at all," Karoline replied, her tone deliberately measured. "I'm simply seeking to understand the basis for the contempt ruling, as is my right under procedural law." A vein pulsed visibly at the judge's temple, throbbing beneath skin the texture of parchment paper. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the bench. "Another 500 for continuing to argue." Prosecutor Whitfield shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him. His eyes darted between Karoline and the judge, uncertainty replacing his earlier complacency. Something wasn't right, and even he could sense it. Karoline took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the stale courtroom air, tasting the faint undertones of furniture polish and anxiety. She reached into her briefcase once more and withdrew a thin manila envelope. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to submit this into evidence." Her voice carried no hint of triumph, no note of challenge, just calm certainty. "What is this?" Hammond demanded, gesturing for the bailiff to bring him the envelope. The bailiff moved with surprising grace for his size, his shoes making soft squeaking sounds against the floor. Judge Hammond's fingers fumbled with the clasp, his hands betraying a slight tremor that hadn't been there moments before. Inside was a series of photographs and bank statements, meticulously organized and annotated. As his eyes scanned the contents, all color drained from his face, leaving it ashen and drawn. The documents showed a pattern of deposits to his personal account, corresponding with favorable judgments for the county tax authority, judgments that had often overridden clear evidence. "I discovered the connection when researching similar cases," Karoline explained quietly. Her words meant only for the judge's ears. "You've ruled against 17 small business owners in the past year, all with documentation similar to mine. All resulted in fines that, coincidentally, matched deposits to your Cayman account within 48 hours. The judge's breathing became shallow, his chest barely moving beneath the heavy robe. His eyes, now wide with panic, darted toward the exit doors. "I've also taken the liberty of providing copies to the State Judicial Ethics Committee and the FBI," Karoline continued, her voice still pitched low. "Their representatives are actually in the gallery today. Please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think about the video." Two figures rose from the back row, a woman in a charcoal suit with a federal badge clipped to her belt, and a man whose stern expression and military posture marked him as law enforcement before he even reached for his credentials. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Spectators gasped and murmured, their collective voices rising like a wave. The bailiff looked to the judge for direction, confusion evident in his furrowed brow. Prosecutor Whitfield sat frozen, his legal pad forgotten before him. "Court is adjourned," Judge Hammond attempted to announce, his voice cracking midway through. "I'm afraid not, Your Honor," said the female FBI agent, her voice cutting through the din. She approached the bench with measured steps, each footfall deliberate and purposeful against the carpeted floor. "Walter Hammond, you're under arrest for multiple counts of bribery, corruption, and abuse of power." The color that had abandoned the judge's face moments before rushed back with a vengeance, turning his complexion to a mottled purple that extended to the tips of his ears. "This is absurd. You can't arrest a sitting judge in his own courtroom." "Actually, we can," replied the male agent, producing handcuffs that gleamed silver under the fluorescent lights. "And we are." The metallic click of the handcuffs closing around Hammond's wrists seemed to echo throughout the now silent courtroom. The black judicial robe, once a symbol of his authority, now hung from his shoulders like a shroud. As the agents led Hammond away, his shoulders hunched in defeat, his eyes fixed on the floor, Karoline remained at her table. She methodically returned her documents to her briefcase, closing the clasp with the same deliberate care with which she had opened them. Prosecutor Whitfield approached her, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "You knew," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You knew all along." Karoline met his gaze steadily. "I did my homework." "I never took money," Whitfield said, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. "But I suspected Hammond's rulings weren't right." Yet you said nothing, Karoline observed, her tone neutral. Whitfield's shoulders slumped. My family. I couldn't risk my position. Karoline closed her briefcase with a definitive click. The FBI will want to speak with you, she said simply. Whitfield nodded, running a trembling hand through his hair. I'll tell them everything I know, he promised, his voice carrying the weight of a belated confession. It's never too late to choose the right path, Mr. Whitfield, Karoline added, lifting her briefcase from the table. But it's always harder when you've walked the wrong one for so long. With that, she turned away from him, leaving the prosecutor standing alone at the table, his legal empire crumbling around him like a house of cards caught in a sudden breeze. Karoline gathered her belongings and walked toward the exit. The courtroom doors, so intimidating hours before, now opened easily under her touch. But behind her, the weight of what had just unfolded still hung in the air. What started as an attempt to put Karoline in her place had unraveled into something far greater. A moment that wouldn't be easily forgotten. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been reclaimed.